History matters. The history of a country that was founded in rebellion against empire and colonialism. George Washington said, "Avoid entangling alliances." John Quincy Adams said, "This country goes not abroad searching for monsters to destroy." Dick Cheney said, "I go abroad looking for countries and people to destroy." How did we go so very far awry? To answer that question, you need a great university and a great Department of History. The University of Wisconsin's Department of History has, for the better part of a century, been in the forefront of exploring the issues of empire and colonialism. Harvey Goldberg, Merle Curdy, Fred Harvey Harrington, William Appleman Williams, giants in the study of empire. And with them, Professor Al McCoy. Al McCoy holds aloft the banner of scholarship. He is the J.R.W. Small Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin. That is a great title. But he is much more than that. He is a great scholar of empire. He is, as well, a brilliant analyst of empire's pathologies. McCoy's book, A Question of Torture, is the essential study of this country's abuses of people and nations, and its violations of that constitutional provision against cruel and unusual punishment. And his new collection, Policing America's Empire, is a groundbreaking study of how fundamentally awry this country has gone. Please welcome a scholar, a citizen, and an American who speaks truth to power about empire and about what this country should be. Al McCoy.
Tonight, I want to talk about impunity in America. With the election of President Obama, the problem of torture has not, as most of us had hoped, simply disappeared, wiped away by new executive orders, striking all of those unfortunate orders of President Bush from the record. Instead, it has now entered a particularly disturbing, a particularly sordid phase called impunity. And if you'll bear with me for 20 minutes, I'll try and explain to you how we got there. To explain how and why this tragic past is still very much a part of our political present, let me offer a short history of psychological torture divided into 5 parts: discovery, development, propagation, legalization, and impunity. Part 1, discovery. On April 28, 2004, Americans were stunned when CBS television broadcast those now notorious photographs from Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison showing hooded Iraqis stripped naked as U.S. soldiers stood by smiling. As this scandal grabbed headlines around the globe, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld insisted the abuses were perpetrated by, quote, a small number of U.S. military. William Safire, conservative New York Times columnist, quickly branded these soldiers as creeps. These soldiers shown in that photo, however, were simple instruments of a larger policy. These photos were not, however, snapshots of simple brutality or a breakdown in military discipline. Take, for example, that most iconic of all those photos showing a hooded Iraqi with electrical wires hanging from his arms. This photo, in my reading, shows not the sadism of a few creeps, but instead the two key trademarks of the CIA's psychological torture paradigm. The hood is for sensory deprivation. The arms are extended for self-inflicted pain. It is that simple. It is that obvious. In short, this photo is a snapshot of a distinctively American form of torture, psychological torture. Viewed historically, the Abu Ghraib scandal is the product of a deeply contradictory U.S. policy toward torture that developed at the start of the Cold War back in the 1950s. Back then, publicly at the United Nations, Washington spoke out loud and strong and clear in opposition to torture, advocating a universal standard of human rights. Simultaneously and secretly, however, the CIA began developing and propagating ingenious new torture techniques in contravention of those same diplomatic conventions. From 1950 to 1962, the CIA led a secret research effort to crack the code of human consciousness, a veritable Manhattan Project of the mind with costs that reach at peak $1 billion a year. Now, during this first decade of research, CIA mind control moved through two distinct phases. First, a bungled, disastrous, in-house CIA exploration of exotic techniques such as hypnosis and hallucinogenic drugs. Then later, a focus on more mundane behavioral experimentation that was subcontracted outside the agency to some of the most brilliant behavioral scientists of their generation. Now, while this agency drug testing led nowhere, the CIA funded behavioral experiments outsourced to the country's leading universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and others, produced two key findings that contributed to the discovery of psychological torture. Discovery number one, which we saw in this film, sensory deprivation. In the early 1950s, famed Canadian psychologist Dr. Donald Hebb, who is in many accounts the author of the modern cognitive scientific revolution. Google Hebb and you get 300,000 to 400,000 hits. He discovered that he could induce a state akin to psychosis in just 48 hours. Now, what had the doctor done? Drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, psychological surgery? No, none of the above. For 2 days, student volunteers at McGill University, where Dr. Hebb was chair of psychology, simply sat in a comfortable, air-conditioned cubicle, deprived of sensory stimulation by goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. If you look at the sketches and the photographs of those students, they look very much like those Guantanamo detainees that we saw in that film, and for good reason. Dr. Hebb himself reported that after just 2 or 3 days of such isolation, quote, the subject's very identity had begun to disintegrate. Discovery number two, self-inflicted pain, what we now call stress positions. During the 1950s as well, two eminent cognitive scientists at Cornell University Medical Center, working under contract for the CIA, found that the Soviet KGB's most devastating torture technique involved not crude physical beatings, but simply forcing the victim to stand for days at a time. The legs swelled, the skin erupted in suppurating lesions, the kidney shut down, hallucinations began, all incredibly painful and without not one single touch. After a decade of this mind control research, in 1963, the CIA codified its findings in a succinct, secret instructional handbook, the QBARC Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, which would soon become the basis for a new psychological torture paradigm disseminated worldwide over the next 3 decades. By the way, you might ask, what does QBARC mean? That's the CIA's cryptonym for itself. So the actual title is the CIA's Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. Now, if genius is the discovery of the obvious, then the CIA's development of this no-touch torture was a counterintuitive breakthrough, the first real revolution in the cruel science of pain in centuries. Through more than 2,000 years of Western judicial torture, the same problem persisted. The strong defied the pain, while the weak would say anything, whatever was necessary to stop it. In the 3rd century AD, when torture of witnesses was required under Roman law, the Roman jurist Ulpian called torture, quote, a delicate, dangerous, and deceptive thing. Everything that we have learned about torture in the past 2,000 years can be summarized in Ulpian's axiom, quote, for many persons have such strength of body and soul that they heed the pain very little, so there is no means of obtaining the truth from them, while others are so susceptible to pain that they will tell any lie rather than suffer it, end quote. Now, by contrast, the CIA's psychological paradigm fused these two new methods, sensory disorientation and self-inflicted pain, whose combination would, in theory, cause victims to feel responsible for their own suffering and thus capitulate more readily, more completely to their torturers. Refined through years of practice, the CIA's use of sensory disorientation relies on seemingly banal procedures, heat and cold, light and dark, noise and silence, feast and famine, for a systematic attack on the basic sensory pathways into the human mind. Now, in its clandestine journey across continents and decades, this distinctively American form of psychological torture would prove elusive, adaptable, powerfully seductive, and devastatingly destructive. Let's review each of these attributes because they are the key to the survival of torture to the present and maybe the key to its perpetuation into the future. First attribute, elusive. Now, unlike its physical variant, psychological torture leaves no traces. It leaves no clear signs of abuse, and it easily eludes detection, greatly complicating investigation, prosecution, or attempt at prohibition. After being trained by British intelligence, who had developed this doctrine in conjunction with the CIA, the Royal Ulster Constabulary applied these psychological methods on IRA suspects in Belfast in 1971 through application of the so-called 5 techniques of enforced wall standing, hooding, blaring music, sleep deprivation, and dietary manipulation. After articles in the press and questions in Parliament about what had happened in Belfast, a parliamentary inquiry headed by Lord Parker of Waddington found these psychological methods greatly complicated any determination of torture. Where, Lord Parker asked, does hardship and discomfort end, and for instance, humiliating treatment begin? And where does the latter end and torture begin? The answer, he said, turns on what he called, with great prescience, words of definition, and thus opinions will inevitably differ. Next, adaptable. In the 40 years since its discovery, the agency's psychological paradigm has proved surprisingly adaptable, with each sustained application, as we will see, producing innovation. Third, seductive. For the perpetrators and the powerful who command them, torture has, I think, a darkly erotic appeal. Even when torture is initially intended for a few Soviet spies or a few top terrorists, it soon spreads uncontrollably, pathologically in 2 directions: rapid proliferation to the torture of the many, and an almost uncontrollable escalation in the scale of brutality. So seductive is torture's appeal that the powerful will always concoct rationales to preserve their prerogative of torture in defiance of all evidence of ineffectiveness and in defiance of evidence of very high political costs. Finally, destructive. Although seemingly less brutal than physical methods, the CIA's no-touch torture actually leaves searing psychological scars. Victims often need years, decades of treatment to recover from a trauma that many treatment experts consider far more crippling than physical pain. Step 2, phase 2, propagating the paradigm. After codification in the 1963 Kubark Manual, the CIA spent the next 30 years propagating these torture techniques within the U.S. intelligence community and among anti-communist allies across Asia and Latin America. In a 1983 training manual, for example, the CIA taught the Honduran military interrogators that they should, quote, manipulate the subject's environment to create intolerable situations to disrupt patterns of time, space, and sensory perception. In short, a total assault on the sensory pathways to the existential platform of human identity. The techniques in this 1983 manual seem strikingly similar to those outlined 20 years earlier in the QBARC manual and those that would be used 20 years later at Abu Ghraib. Now, when the Cold War came to a close in 1990, Washington resumed its advocacy of human rights, ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture in 1994 that banned the infliction of severe psychological and physical pain. Now, on the surface, the United States had apparently resolved the tension between its anti-torture principles and its torture practices. But when President Clinton sent this UN convention to Congress for ratification in 1994, he included language drafted 6 years earlier by the Reagan administration with 4 detailed qualifications, 4 detailed diplomatic reservations focused on one word, just one word in the convention's 26 printed pages. That word was mental. Significantly, these carefully constructed diplomatic reservations redefine torture for the United States to exclude sensory deprivation and self-inflicted pain, the very techniques that the CIA developed. This definition was then reproduced verbatim right down to the semicolons in domestic legislation enacted to give force to the UN Convention. First in Section 2340 of the U.S. Federal Code. Now, remember that number. That's the trouble with gatherings like this. You know, no blue books, no exams, nothing to wake you up and drive the points home. But just think about it, okay? 2340, okay? Now you can go back to sleep and my cadences will lull you back off, okay? 2340, we'll come back to it, okay? It's a very important number in understanding what happened, why torture is still with us. Now, in effect, as I said, Washington split the convention down the middle, banning physical torture but exempting psychological torture. A year later, in 1995, when the Clinton administration launched its covert campaign against al-Qaeda, the CIA avoided direct involvement in torture by sending some 70 terror suspects to allied nations notorious for brutal physical torture. This is called extraordinary rendition, and it's banned in the UN Convention, even the version as ratified by the United States. By failing to repudiate the CIA's use of torture, while adopting a UN convention that condemned its practice, the United States left this contradiction buried like a political landmine, ready to explode with such phenomenal force just 10 years later in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. Step 3, perfection of the CIA's psychological paradigm. Right after his public address to a shaken nation on September 11, 2001, President Bush, after the cameras had been turned off, gave his White House staff secret orders saying, quote, "I don't care what the international lawyers say, we are going to kick some ass," end quote. In the months that followed, administration attorneys translated their president's eloquent but otherwise unlawful orders into U.S. policy through 3 controversial neoconservative legal doctrines. 1, the president is above the law. 2, torture is legally acceptable. And 3, the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay is not U.S. territory. In their now notorious August 2002 memos, Assistant Attorney General Jay Bybee and his associate John Yoo, about whom we heard in the film, concluded that pain equivalent to organ failure was legal, effectively allowing torture right up to the point of death. Further up the chain of command, a top national security team led by Vice President Cheney and Attorney General John Ashcroft met regularly in the White House to approve physical abuse such as wall slamming and waterboarding. This national security team authorized every CIA request for torture, and Ashcroft himself once told the agency it was perfectly legal to waterboard one detainee 119 times. Consequently, the White House authorized the CIA to build a global network of 8 prisons, the so-called black sites, located in allied nations from Thailand to Poland. The White House also allowed the CIA 10 enhanced interrogation methods designed by agency psychologists, including waterboarding, a particularly cruel method that replicates drowning. Now here we must pause because this is critical. This is the most extreme of the Bush administration torture techniques. So here we must ask, is waterboarding a perfectly legal enhanced technique, just a little dunk of water, as Vice President Cheney once called it, or is waterboarding so cruel that it constitutes torture? After French paratroopers tortured him with this technique, which the French called the water pipe, during the Battle of Algiers in 1957, a French journalist named Henri Alleg wrote a moving description of this method in a book that turned France against torture and indeed the Algerian War. I quote, "I tried by contracting my throat to take in as little water as possible and to resist suffocation by keeping air in my lungs for as long as I could. But I could not hold on for more than a few moments. I had the impression of drowning, and a terrible agony, that of death itself, took possession of me." Now let's think for a second about the deeper meaning of Alleg's sparse words. A terrible agony, that of death itself, took possession of me. Although written years, decades, before science discovered this cognitive reflex, Alleg's words were an eerily accurate summary of something called the mammalian diving reflex. This is a deep-seated fear hardwired into the human brain that allows infants, when plunged into cold water, to survive and emerge from water, total drowning, complete submersion, without any brain damage, not for 3 minutes, not for 5 minutes, not for 15 minutes, but for up to 20 minutes. So afraid is the human organism of this cold water over the mouth that we have this reflex hardwired into us. As waterboarding blocks air to the lungs, the human organism's powerful mammalian diving reflex kicks in, and the brain is racked by the most horrifically painful panic signals imaginable to the organism. Death, death, death. Then the victim vomits water, the lungs suck air, the fear recedes, the panic subsides, and then it happens again and again, 119, 132, 187 times in 1 month, inscribing the searing trauma of near death in human memory and producing one of the most extreme forms of pain imaginable, the visceral fear of death itself, the ultimate fear, the one fear that nobody can ever really conquer. In late 2002, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld appointed General Jeffrey Miller to command Guantanamo with a wide latitude for interrogation, making this prison an ad hoc behavioral laboratory. Under General Miller, Guantanamo's interrogators stiffened the psychological assault by exploring Arab cultural sensitivity to sexuality and fear of dogs. General Miller also formed behavioral science consultation teams of military psychologists who probed each detainee for individual phobias, such as fear of dark or attachment to mother. Through this total 3-phase attack on sensory receptors, cultural identity, and individual psyche, Guantanamo thereby perfected the CIA's psychological paradigm. After a visit from the Guantanamo Chief, General Miller, in September 2003, the U.S. Commander for Iraq, General Ricardo Sanchez, issued orders for sophisticated psychological torture. As I read from those orders, please listen for the combination of the 3 key techniques: sensory disorientation, self-inflicted pain, and that recent innovation, cultural humiliation. Quote, U, environmental manipulation, altering the environment to create moderate discomfort, e.g., adjusting temperatures. V, sleep adjustment, adjusting the sleeping times of the detainee, reversing sleeping cycles from night to day. X, isolation, isolating the detainee from other detainees for up to 30 days. Y, presence of military working dogs, exploits Arab fear of dogs. AA, yelling, loud music, and light control, used to create fear, disorient detainee, and prolong capture shock. Stressed positions, use of physical posturing, sitting, standing, kneeling. It is no accident that Private Lindy England was famously photographed leading an Iraqi detainee leashed like a dog. Step 4, legalization of psychological torture. Confronted by public anger over the expose of Abu Ghraib, the Bush White House fought back by defending torture as a presidential prerogative necessary for the war on terror. But in June of 2006, in a dramatic rebuke of the president's position, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Hamdan v. Rumsfeld that Bush's military commissions were illegal because they did not meet the requirements of the Geneva Conventions. Then on September 6, 2006, in a dramatic bid, a televised meeting in front of the 9/11 families inside the East Room of the White House, President Bush announced that he was transferring 14 top al-Qaeda captives from the secret CIA prisons to Guantanamo Bay. To allow the CIA program with its alternative set of procedures to go forward, President Bush announced that he was sending legislation to Congress that would legalize the same presidential prerogatives on the treatment of detainees that had just been challenged by the Supreme Court. On September 21st, after tense day-long negotiations inside Vice President Cheney's Senate office, Republican partisans reached a compromise that sailed through the Congress within a week without any amendment to become the Military Commissions Law 2006. Now, in drafting this law, Dick Cheney took enormous care to give the CIA interrogators an absolute immunity against any future prosecution for both physical pain and psychological torture. Let's see how he did it. Buried deep inside this law's 38 pages of dense black print, Cheney included clauses defining serious physical pain as, listen for it, the significant loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. Now, you've just heard me quote that. That's the most notorious, the most outrageous quote from all of the Bush torture memos. That's right out of the John Yoo, August 2002 torture member, which defines pain equivalent to organ failure as perfectly legal. Let me be clear. A definition of torture so outrageous that it had already been repudiated by the Bush Justice Department was actually written into the law of this land. That is the law of this land right now. It's on the books. Above all, the Military Commissions Act protected the CIA's use of psychological torture by repeating verbatim the exculpatory language found in those Clinton-era reservations to the UN Convention, still embedded in Section 2340 of the Federal Code. The final phase, impunity in America. Not only were the Bush administration's Justice Department lawyers aggressive in their advocacy of torture, they were meticulous right from the start in laying the legal groundwork for later impunity or immunity for crimes of torture. Now, no matter how twisted the process might be, impunity, whether in England, France, Indonesia, or America, usually passes through 3 stages. First, blame the bad apples. Next, invoke national security, saying these methods saved lives, they protected us. Finally, appeal to national unity, saying we need to put the past behind us and move forward together. Let's see now how we have moved step by step toward impunity for torture in the 9 months since President Obama took office. First, blame the bad apples. Step 1. For a year after the Abu Ghraib expose, Rumsfeld's Pentagon blamed the bad apples by claiming the abuse was, quote, perpetrated by a small number of U.S. military. In his statement on May 13th of this year, while refusing to release more of the torture photos, President Obama, I think unwittingly, echoed Rumsfeld, claiming abuse in these latest images, quote, was carried out in the past by a small number of individuals, end quote. Second, invoke national security. In past months, Republicans have taken us deep into this second stage of impunity with Cheney's statements that the CIA's methods, quote, prevented the violent deaths of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, a claim that the Obama administration has not disputed. Third and finally, the appeal to unity. Just last April, President Obama brought us to the third and final stage of impunity when he visited CIA headquarters and promised there would be no prosecutions of agency employees, saying, quote, "We made some mistakes, but it's time to acknowledge them and then move forward." This process of impunity is leading Washington back to a global torture policy that during the Cold War was bipartisan in nature and very contradictory, publicly advocating human rights while covertly outsourcing torture to allied governments. In retrospect, it now seems clear that the real aberration of the Bush years lay not in torture per se, but in President Bush's orders that the CIA should operate its own prisons, which they did for the first time in their history under Bush, and that American agents, American CIA agents, should dirty their own hands with waterboarding and wall slamming. Backed by the White House, Obama's new CIA director, Leon Panetta, has announced on the record that the CIA would continue to engage in the rendition, the sending of terrorist suspects to allies like Libya, Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia, where we can, of course, be assured that they will receive good, humane treatment. Let us now reflect upon the meaning of this sad history. In retrospect, this recourse to CIA psychological torture has corrupted U.S. intelligence and compromised America's international standing. In 2004, the CIA's own Inspector General conducted a careful review of all the intelligence gained from the CIA black sites and concluded that there was no clear evidence that these so-called enhanced techniques had worked. Indeed, a former FBI interrogator, Ali Sofan, who was inside those same black sites, has argued that all the real intelligence that we gained from those prisons came from non-coercive, humane interrogation. But if torture does not work in extracting objective, accurate intelligence, what is it good for? Torture is very good, as we know, in forcing victims to make false confessions. Indeed, there is strong evidence that the Bush administration, in the months before the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, used torture quite effectively to fabricate evidence of an alliance between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. After the CIA began interrogation of the first al-Qaeda captive, a man named Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, in early 2002, CIA Director Tenet testified before the Senate that Iraq had, quote, provided unspecified chemical weapons training for 2 al-Qaeda associates. Based on that same CIA intelligence, Secretary of State Colin Powell told the UN Security Council on the eve of the Iraq War in February 2003 that, quote, this detainee, referring to Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, describes Iraq offering chemical weapons training for 2 al-Qaeda associates. A year later, in 2004, however, al-Libi was interviewed by American investigators, and he apologized that he had lied and fabricated all of these statements in order to stop the torture. To get socks in a bed, he had named names. After 17 hours in a small box, he invented a story about 3 or 2 al-Qaeda members who went to Iraq to learn about nuclear weapons. In May of 2009, just weeks ago, Secretary Powell's former military aide, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, charged that Vice President Cheney ordered the repeated waterboarding of al-Libi until he gave that false intelligence about contacts between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. With just socks, a box, and a wet rag, the CIA easily fabricated convincing intelligence that dazzled the U.S. Senate and persuaded the UN Security Council, illustrating the extraordinary power of torture to force false confessions and to compromise U.S. intelligence. Unless some formal inquiry is convened to look into this sordid history that reached its depths under the Bush era and so begin to break this cycle of deceit, expose, and political paralysis, in a few years' time, we're likely to be right back here, like we've been 6 times in the last 40 years, in this mess over torture. Once again, in the future, in the not-too-distant future, we will be confronted with the next American torture scandal from some new iconic dungeon in a long, dismal procession from the tiger cages of South Vietnam through the concrete cells of Abu Ghraib and the wire cages of Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Next time, however, the world will not have forgotten those photos from Abu Ghraib. Next time, the damage to this country's international reputation will be nothing less than devastating. For as a powerfully symbolic state practice, synonymous with brutal autocrats through the ages, torture, even of the few, even of just one human being, raises profound moral issues about the quality of America's justice, the character of its civilization, and the legitimacy of its global leadership. Thank you.